My son-in-law announced the end of my farm while standing beneath a chandelier I had paid for. Blake Thornton raised a champagne glass, put one arm around my daughter, and smiled at 200 wedding guests seated between the vines. Emma and I aren't just starting a marriage tonight, he said. We're starting a legacy. People applauded. Behind him, the projector changed from a photograph of Emma as a child to an architect's rendering I had never seen. The image showed a stone hotel, 42 villas, 3 swimming pools, and a road cutting straight through the oldest Cabernet Rose on Boone Hollow Farm. Blake pointed at the screen. This vineyard is our starter asset, he said. After the honeymoon, we'll leverage the land and begin phase 1 of Boone Ridge Resort. The investors at table 6 stood to clap. I did not. Emma looked at me from the head table. For half a second, her smile disappeared. Then she lifted her glass with everybody else. Blake continued describing luxury cabins, a spa, and a conference center as if the vineyard already belonged to him. He told the guests that family land should create generational wealth instead of sitting under grapes forever. That line earned a laugh. I looked past the dance floor toward the south slope. My wife Ruth and I had planted the first vines there 41 years earlier. The rows were invisible in the dark, but I knew every rise in the ground and every place rainwater collected after a storm. Blake saw collateral. I saw my life. When his toast ended, I placed my napkin beside my plate and walked out through the catering doors. My attorney was waiting near the barrel room because I had invited her to the wedding. At 7:46 p.m., while the staff cleared the dinner plates, I signed one page on the hood of her car. By the time dessert was served, no bank, investor, heir, or future owner could ever build Blake's resort on my farm. My name is Walter Boone. I am 68 years old, and Boone Hollow is a 146-acre vineyard in Virginia's Shenandoah Valley. I own the land, the winery, the equipment, and the house where my daughter took her first steps. I also paid $84,000 for the wedding where her husband publicly claimed all of it. The farm did not begin as an inheritance. Ruth and I bought 63 neglected acres in 1982 with a loan my father called foolish. The farmhouse had no central heat. The lower field flooded every spring. Our first grape crop was destroyed by a late frost, and our second produced wine that tasted like furniture polish. We kept going. I drove a feed truck before sunrise and worked the vineyard until dark. Ruth handled the books, learned laboratory testing, and persuaded restaurants to place our bottles on their lists. We added land in 3 small parcels, never borrowing more than one harvest could reasonably repay. Emma grew up inside that effort. She rode on my shoulders while I checked trellises. At 8, she could tell Chardonnay leaves from Cabernet Franc. At 14, she ran the farm stand on Saturdays. At 22, she left Virginia for a marketing job in Charlotte and said she loved the farm too much to let it become the only life she was allowed to choose. I told her I understood. I did mostly. Ruth died of ovarian cancer 9 years before the wedding. During her last winter, she made me promise 2 things. Do not let grief turn the house into a museum, and do not pressure Emma into coming home. I kept both promises. What I did not do was explain exactly what I meant every time I told Emma, this will all be yours someday. To me, that sentence meant she would inherit responsibility for a working farm. She could collect income, choose managers, preserve the soil, and pass something living to the next generation. To Emma, it meant a deed with no conditions. I allowed that difference to remain because clear conversations about death made me uncomfortable. My vagueness helped create the entitlement that later humiliated me in front of 200 people. But vagueness is not permission. Emma met Blake 3 years before the wedding. He was 37, well-dressed, confident, and employed by a real estate development company that built apartment complexes near interstate exits. He knew how to make a spreadsheet feel like destiny. The first time he visited Boone Hollow, he did not ask which grapes grew on the south slope. He asked how many acres were unencumbered. I told myself he was making conversation in the language he understood. At dinner, Blake described the tasting room as undermonetized. He said weddings could produce 4 times the revenue if we added lodging. He estimated that my river frontage alone could support 30 high-end cabins. I told him the riverbank was a wildlife corridor and flooded every 6 or 7 years. He called that a design challenge. Emma told me afterward that Blake admired what Ruth and I had built. She said he wanted to help modernize it, not take it away. For a while, his ideas sounded reasonable. We did need a new bottling line. Our website was 10 years old. The tasting room closed too early for weekend visitors. Blake arranged a meeting with a hospitality consultant who suggested small improvements that increased revenue without changing the farm. I began to trust him. Then the scale changed. The first serious warning came at our harvest dinner the year before the wedding. Boone Hollow hosts one meal each October for employees, restaurant buyers, and neighbors who help during picking season. Blake arrived with a drone operator. He said he wanted footage for our website. 2 weeks later, Emma showed me his promotional video. Gold lines divided the farm into hospitality zones. The barrel barn became a spa, the worker cottages became suites, and the south slope was labeled Future Residential. I made him remove the video. Blake apologized, then sent a projection claiming one resort villa could earn more than 4 acres of grapes. It ignored debt, utilities, staffing, roads, flood controls, and winery sales. When I pointed that out, he said farmers confused attachment with analysis. Emma defended him. She said he was not insulting my work. He was trying to keep Boone Hollow competitive after I retired. I asked what retirement had to do with removing vines. Neither of them answered. That winter, Blake invited me to lunch with two tourism partners. One asked about zoning, the other wanted to know whether Ruth had left Emma any ownership. I ended the meeting and told Blake investors should not discuss my land without knowing I opposed development. He said, "They know ownership is transitioning." I should have understood then that he was not waiting for my decision. He was selling certainty built from my reluctance to make one. He formed Thornton Ridge Hospitality and started bringing surveyors to neighboring properties. He talked about destination tourism, branded residences, and unlocking dormant equity. When I reminded him that Boone Hollow was not for sale, he said he understood. He simply believed I would give it away. 6 months before the wedding, Emma asked me to meet with an estate planning attorney Blake recommended. She said marriage made it important to clarify succession. The attorney presented a diagram in which I transferred the farm into a family holding company. Emma would receive 51% of the voting shares immediately. I would retain the farmhouse for life, and Thornton Ridge Hospitality would become the farm's exclusive development manager. I asked why my future son-in-law's company needed any role in my estate. The attorney called it operational alignment. I called my own lawyer the next morning. Her name is Lydia Price. She had represented Ruth and me for 26 years. Lydia reviewed the proposal and said it was not estate planning. It was control transferred through friendly language. If I signed, Emma and Blake could outvote me, pledge company assets as security, replace management, and approve development agreements while I still lived in the house. I rejected the proposal. Emma cried. She said I was treating her like a stranger. Blake remained calm and said there was no rush. There was a rush. I simply did not know about it. By then, Blake had an option contract on 62 acres adjoining my western boundary. The seller, Curtis Wynn, agreed to hold the land for 9 months in exchange for a non-refundable deposit of $175,000. Blake planned to combine that parcel with Boone Hollow and present the entire site to investors as a $300 million resort opportunity. His loan commitment depended on two things: proof that Thornton Ridge would control my land and an appraisal based on commercial development potential. He had neither. What he did have was Emma's confidence that I would sign eventually. 2 months before the wedding, she brought a leather folder to my house. She said it contained updated medical directives, access forms for the farm accounts, and routine documents we should finish before she traveled overseas. I opened the folder while she made coffee. The first paper was a health care authorization. The second allowed her to speak with my insurance company. The third was a durable financial power of attorney, broad enough to let her manage real property if I became incapacitated. The fourth was a deed transferring Boone Hollow into the same family holding company I had already rejected. The signature tabs were marked in yellow. I asked why the deed was there. Emma said it was only to avoid probate. I told her probate did not require giving up control while I was alive. She said Blake's attorney had explained everything and accused Lydia of filling my head with fear. I removed the health documents, handed back the deed, and said we would discuss succession after the wedding. Emma heard "after the wedding" as a promise that I would sign. I meant that I would discuss it. That was another sentence our family allowed to carry two meanings. Lydia urged me to act immediately. For years, Ruth and I had considered donating a conservation easement to the Valley Land Trust. The agreement would keep the acreage privately owned and productive, but permanently prohibit subdivisions, hotels, golf courses, large commercial venues, and non-agricultural development. The farmhouse, winery, tasting room, and normal farm improvements would remain legal. The restriction would run with the deed forever. Ruth wanted it. I hesitated because it would reduce the appraised development value and limit Emma's future choices. After Ruth died, I kept telling Lydia I needed more time. The land trust completed soil surveys, habitat mapping, and a baseline report anyway. Its board approved the easement subject to my final signature. A 43-page deed sat in Lydia's office for almost a year. All it lacked was one signed page. I still had not signed it on the morning of the wedding. That is important. I did not enter the reception planning revenge. I entered it hoping my daughter would be happy. The ceremony took place on the lawn above the vines. Emma wore Ruth's pearl earrings. When I walked her down the aisle, she squeezed my arm and whispered, "I wish Mom could see this." I almost told her Ruth was present in every row of grapes behind us. Instead, I said, "She would be proud of you." I paid for the tent, the band, the flowers, the food, and the open bar. I also agreed to cover a 12-day honeymoon in Italy. The travel company required a final payment of $14,800 by midnight after the wedding. I had not made that payment yet. Blake's toast began after the main course. His architect's renderings appeared on the screen before I understood what I was seeing. The hotel covered the hillside where Ruth's ashes had been scattered. The proposed access road crossed an easement we used for tractors. A wedding pavilion stood where our oldest vines grew. Then Blake called the farm his starter asset. He thanked 3 investors by name. He thanked a regional bank vice president for believing in Phase 1. He told the guests construction would begin the following spring. This was not a dream shared privately with my daughter. It was a financing announcement. And my land was the proof he offered. You may think I should have taken the microphone and corrected him in front of everyone. For a few seconds I wanted to, but humiliation was the tool Blake had chosen. I did not need to use it better than he did. I needed to make his claim impossible. I walked through the catering doors and called Lydia. She answered on the second ring. "I am at table 19, she said. I had forgotten that her husband Tom was one of Ruth's oldest friends. They had arrived during cocktail hour while I was taking photographs. I asked whether the conservation deed was still ready. Lydia was silent for a moment. "The land trust approval expires next Friday," she said. "Why?" I looked through the open doors at the resort rendering. "Because I am done asking for more time." Lydia left the reception and retrieved the document from a locked case in her car. She had brought it because we planned to discuss my estate after the wedding weekend. The land trust director had already signed the acceptance page before traveling out of state. Tom was a notary. The easement itself was 43 pages. My decision occupied one signature line on the final page. Lydia reviewed the effect again. Boone Hollow could remain a vineyard. We could expand agricultural buildings within designated zones, host limited tastings, and sell wine. We could not build Blake's resort. Neither Emma nor any future buyer could cancel the restrictions. A court could enforce them even against the owner. "Once this is recorded, you cannot change your mind because the family is angry," she said. "I understand. Do you want to wait until tomorrow?" I heard applause from inside the tent. Blake had reached the part of his speech where he thanked me for trusting the next generation. No. At 7:46 p.m., I signed the page on the hood of Lydia's car. Tom notarized it. Lydia scanned the signature and sent the completed deed to the Land Trust's filing service. Because the courthouse was closed, the original would be recorded Monday morning. The signed agreement was already binding between me and the Land Trust. I went back inside before the servers carried out the lemon cake. Emma watched me return. Blake gave me a wide smile and lifted his glass as though we shared a secret. I sat down, finished my dinner, and said nothing. That silence made people uncomfortable. Emma leaned over during dessert. Are you upset about the presentation? I was surprised. Blake wanted everyone to see the vision. They saw it. She said the renderings were preliminary and that no decision would be made without me. 10 minutes earlier, her husband had announced a construction date to his investors. I asked whether she had given the bank any documents concerning Boone Hollow. Her eyes moved toward Blake. Only planning materials. Did you represent that you would own the land? Eventually. That word answered enough. I stayed for the first dance. I stayed while Blake danced with his mother and Emma danced with me. She rested her head against my shoulder, and for 3 minutes she was the child who once fell asleep in the tractor cab. I did not tell her what I had signed. Revenge stories often make silence look effortless. Mine was not. I loved my daughter during every second I allowed her celebration to continue. I also understood that love without boundaries had helped bring us there. At 10:30, the wedding coordinator reminded me about the honeymoon payment. I told her I would not authorize it. The flights had been purchased with points from Blake's business account. The hotels and private tours were on a courtesy hold secured by my card. Without the final payment, the itinerary would be released at midnight. I paid every bill connected to the wedding itself. The musicians finished. The caterers were tipped. Nobody lost wages because of my decision. I simply stopped financing what came next. At 11:48, Emma texted from the bridal suite. The travel company says the honeymoon balance is unpaid. Is there a problem? I replied, yes, we will discuss it tomorrow. She called twice. I turned off my phone and watched the band play its final song. I remained until the last dinner table was cleared. Before the guests left, the bank vice president Blake had thanked during his toast approached me near the gift table. His name was Martin Keene. He shook my hand and said the Thornton project could transform tourism in the county. Blake tells me the family transfer is scheduled for next month, he said. I asked whether he had seen a signed deed. Martin's smile tightened. We have a representation from the project principals. I am the property owner. I have made no such representation. He glanced across the room toward Blake. Then perhaps we should speak Monday. Speak to your borrower. I did not tell Martin about the easement. The filing service would notify the title company soon enough, and I wanted the record, not an argument at a wedding, to deliver the answer. Lydia asked if I wanted to speak to Emma before leaving. I watched my daughter hug her college friends while checking her phone for the travel payment. Tonight she would hear punishment, I said. Tomorrow she can hear a boundary. Then I walked home between the vines. Music followed me halfway up the hill. At midnight, the honeymoon reservation expired. The confrontation happened at 9 the next morning in my farmhouse kitchen. Emma arrived wearing jeans beneath a white bride sweatshirt. Blake still had his wedding ring tan line drawn by the photographer's makeup. Neither had slept much. Emma began with the honeymoon. You embarrassed us, she said. The guests did not know. The hotel canceled our suite. Then pay for another one. Blake stepped between us with his calm developer voice. He said emotions had run high and that the presentation was intended as a tribute. He had used starter asset to describe the farm's role in a diversified family portfolio, not to diminish what I built. I asked him to show me the loan commitment. His face changed. Emma said the financing was confidential. I placed a copy of the conservation deed on the table. So is my land, I said. Blake read the first page quickly. Then he turned to the development restrictions. His hand stopped at the paragraph prohibiting hotels, residential subdivisions, spas, golf facilities, and commercial conference centers. This isn't recorded, he said. It will be tomorrow. You signed this last night? Before dessert. Emma looked at the signature page, then at me. You permanently damaged my inheritance because of a toast? I permanently protected my farm because you and your husband used it to secure money without my consent. She said I had always promised Boone Hollow would belong to her. I agreed. You will benefit from the farm, I said. You will not use the dirt beneath it as chips in somebody else's deal. Blake said I did not understand development finance. He had already spent money based on my verbal promises. Investors had relied on Emma's future ownership. The wind property option would expire in 5 weeks. I asked whether he had told Curtis Wynn that he controlled Boone Hollow. He said the option contract only required a development plan. A development plan using my land, using the combined site. That means my land. His calm voice disappeared. He called the easement vindictive, economically irrational, and possibly the product of diminished capacity. Emma flinched when he said the last part, but did not correct him. I told them Lydia would respond to any legal challenge. Then I handed Emma a second document. It revoked the broad financial power of attorney she had asked me to sign. I kept the limited health care authorization in place and named Lydia as alternate financial agent. Emma began to cry. I wanted to comfort her. I did not move. She asked whether I was cutting her out of my life. No, I said. I am removing your access to assets you treated as already yours. Blake took her arm and led her outside. At 8:12 Monday morning, the county clerk recorded the conservation easement. By 9, it appeared in the title company's search. At 10:23, Blake's lender requested an emergency conference call. The bank's preliminary appraisal had valued Boone Hollow at $8.6 million based on potential resort zoning. Under the conservation easement, the land retained strong agricultural value but lost most of its speculative development value. More important, it could no longer be used for the project described in the loan documents. The bank did not accuse Blake of fraud. It did something more immediate. It withdrew the commitment. Emma called me 4 minutes after Blake left the conference room. She said I had made him look dishonest. I told her the bank had asked for collateral he did not own. They approved the structure because we told them the transfer was coming, she said. Who is we? She became quiet. Emma had signed a letter stating that she expected controlling ownership of Boone Hollow before the loan closed. It used the future tense carefully enough to sound harmless and confidently enough to influence the lender. I asked whether she had shown the bank my rejected holding company proposal. She said Blake's attorney advised that it was privileged planning material. Did you tell them I rejected it? She began crying. For most of her life, tears made me look for a problem I could solve. That morning, solving the immediate problem would have meant releasing the farm from the easement, if that had even been possible, and rescuing the same deception that caused it. I said, send the bank a corrected letter today. She asked what would happen if the investors sued. Tell them the truth before their lawyers have to discover it. She said I sounded cold. I told her I was trying to be precise because imprecise promises had already cost us enough. Emma sent the correction. The investors withdrew under clauses covering lost site control and inaccurate representations. Blake blamed her for putting the admission in writing. That was the first crack in their united story. 2 equity investors followed that afternoon. The third asked for a revised plan limited to the neighboring wind parcel. Without my acreage, there was no room for the hotel, wastewater system, or main entrance. The numbers did not work. By Friday, all 3 investors were gone. Blake had spent $175,000 on the non-refundable deposit for the Wynn property. $40,000 came from his savings. The rest came from a short-term business loan he had personally guaranteed. He tried to sell the option to another developer. The property had poor road access without Boone Hollow, and no buyer would pay enough to cover his position. Curtis Wynn offered a 30-day extension for another $25,000. Blake refused. 5 weeks after the wedding, the option expired. Curtis kept the deposit. Blake lost the money, the investors, and the development project he had introduced as a certainty during his wedding toast. He did not lose his job immediately. His employer placed him on leave after discovering he had used company renderings and a junior architect for a personal venture without formal approval. 3 months later, they terminated him for violating conflict of interest rules. I did not call his employer. One of the investors did. That distinction mattered to me. I protected my land. I withdrew my money. The rest came from promises Blake had made to people who expected those promises to be true. Emma did not speak to me for 7 weeks. During that time, rumors spread through the Vineyard community. Some guests said I had sabotaged my daughter's future out of pride. Others called what I did brilliant. Both descriptions made the decision sound cleaner than it felt. I walked the South Rows each morning and wondered whether Ruth would have approved of the timing. I knew she would have approved of the easement. I was less certain she would have approved of signing it during our daughter's wedding. Lydia reminded me that waiting one more day could have allowed Blake to record a notice, submit altered lender documents, or pressure Emma into signing something else. The land was safest because I acted when I did. Safety did not remove sorrow. Emma returned to Boone Hollow in late August. She came alone and found me repairing irrigation lines behind the equipment barn. She did not apologize first. She asked whether the profit share offer was still real. Before the wedding, Lydia and I had drafted a succession plan separate from the land title. Boone Hollow Operations would lease the protected acreage from me and run the vineyard, winery, and events business. Emma could receive a non-voting 30% interest in that company. She would share profits but could not mortgage, sell, or develop the underlying land. I had planned to give her that interest as a wedding gift. I did not give it to her on the wedding night. Instead, I required 6 months of financial transparency, independent counseling, and service on the farm's advisory board. Emma called the conditions punishment. I said they were the difference between receiving income and receiving control. She told me Blake believed the easement destroyed generational wealth. I asked her what she believed. For the first time, she answered without speaking for him. I believed the farm was mine because you always said it would be, she said. Then I started acting like you were already gone. That was the first honest sentence either of us had spoken about inheritance. I admitted my part. I had used vague promises to avoid difficult planning. I had treated Emma as a future steward without asking whether she wanted the responsibility or teaching her what stewardship required. When Blake offered a version that involved money and no mud, she accepted it. But she had still placed a deed among medical documents. She had still allowed a lender to believe ownership was guaranteed. She had still raised her glass while her husband announced my future for me. We did not erase those facts with one conversation. Emma completed the 6 months. She attended advisory meetings, reviewed real harvest costs, and spent weekends learning why vineyard revenue could look impressive while cash remained tied up in barrels. She helped rebuild the website without charging the farm. She and Blake entered marriage counseling. Whether their marriage survives is still their decision, not mine. Blake came to see me once. He did not apologize for calling the farm a starter asset. He apologized for announcing the resort before I signed anything, which was not the same thing. He asked whether I would release 20 acres near the highway from the easement so he could revive a smaller hotel project. I told him conservation agreements do not contain father-in-law exceptions. He left angry. If you are deciding whether I punish my daughter for choosing the wrong husband, look at what she ultimately received. I did not disinherit her. I separated love from ownership and income from the power to destroy the source of it. 1 year after the wedding, Emma received her 30% non-voting interest in Boone Hollow operations. Her first distribution was $23,400. It was not resort money. It was profit earned from wine, weddings, tastings, and grapes grown on protected soil. The land remained in my name. My will now transfers it to a charitable family trust governed by the conservation easement. Emma will have a seat on the trust board, but no individual beneficiary can sell the acreage or pledge it as collateral. The old vines Blake wanted to remove produced their best Cabernet harvest in a decade. We bottled part of it under a new label called Ruth's Promise. Emma designed the label. I approved it only after she removed the gold drawing of a resort hotel she first offered as a joke. We can laugh about that now carefully. The honeymoon never happened. Emma and Blake spent 4 days at a borrowed lake house instead. I did not reimburse them. The $14,800 I had planned to spend went toward replacing irrigation pumps and establishing a paid apprenticeship for young vineyard workers. I stayed at the wedding until the final dinner table was cleared because my response was never meant to destroy my daughter's wedding. It was meant to stop her husband from converting a celebration into a closing meeting for land he did not own. The photograph from that night hangs in my farmhouse hallway. Emma is beside me in Ruth's earrings. Blake stands on her other side, smiling like the future has already signed his documents. Behind us, the south slope disappears into evening. No hotel stands there, no villas interrupt the rouse. The river still floods when spring rain comes, and the old Cabernet vines still require more work than any spreadsheet admits. Someday, Emma may run Boone Hollow. She may earn more of the operating company. She may teach her own children how to prune vines and read a balance sheet, but she will never inherit the right to erase the farm. Blake called Boone Hollow his starter asset before dessert. All I signed was one page. It was enough to make sure the land outlived his plan.